Hello and welcome to the Mad Knitting YouTube channel. My name is Susan. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin, where I live and work. This is episode 16. It is Wednesday, April 13th, 2022. And I'm on social media. You can find me on Instagram as madtown_mama. You can find me on Ravelry, if that is a site you can use, as madtownmama without the underscore. And I also recently joined the Making Co app, which I'm not on a lot because I'm still kind of figuring it out, but I am madtownmama there as well. So this is where I share my crafting life. Occasionally I talk about other things that I feel like sharing. And mostly what I talk about is knitting. So if you're here for the knitting, welcome. Actually, if you're here for any reason, welcome. But I assume that if you're here, it's because you like to hear me talk about knitting. So there'll be a lot of that today. I will start with, I have two finished objects to show you, and these were not even on the radar in my last episode, which was a little under 2 weeks ago. I have this long-term, this bigger project that you'll hear more about later. But I reached a point where I needed a few days off from it. And I needed a palette cleanser, and I did not have a very busy weekend. So I churned out a couple things that I'm going to share with you first. So the first is a hat. This is called Cherry Rumble. It is a brand new pattern out by Thea Coleman. She is also known as Baby Cocktails. She just released this last Friday, and I really liked it. And I've actually done a ton of test knitting for Thea, like for years and years. So she sent me a copy as a gift, which was very, very kind of her. And when I wanted a quick project and I saw how charming the stitch pattern was, I thought, okay, there's my answer. That's what I'll make. So here's how it looks on. The Cherry Rumble, she names all of her patterns after cocktails or after drinks. I don't know anything about the Cherry Rumble. I'm not really a cocktail person. But it features this really cool cable lace pattern. It's basically done in a 1x1 rib. And you do this cable lace pattern with some increases and decreases, and it's really, really stretchy. And it was really fun to execute. The hat comes in two sizes. So I made the smaller one, counting on the stretch. And at first I thought, oh, this will be really great to wear under my bike helmet when I have bike rides on chilly days. But y'all, I have so many hats. Like honestly don't need another one. So as much as I love this, I think it's going to be a gift for a very good friend of mine whose birthday is coming up. And I really think she would like it. Anyway, let me tell you about the yarn. The yarn, I don't have a label with me, but it is Periwinkle Sheep Merino DK. So it's 100% superwash yarn, which is not at all what Thea calls for in the pattern, but she does call for a DK weight. I used, the contrast brim is the color Beaujolais, and the main body is in the color Bisque, which I think is a really good name because it really does kind of look like kind of a creamy, mushroomy color. These are colors that were sold exclusively on the Modern Daily Knitting website a few years ago, but they no longer sell periwinkle sheep yarn. So I had bought a fair amount of it when they were putting it on clearance. So that's why I have this yarn. And the Beaujolais is left over from another project. I just had this little nugget. I actually weighed it to try to figure out exactly how many yards there were. And it turned out that I had exactly enough of that one leftover bit for the brim. And then And then I used the bisque for the rest of it. So it's a really fun pattern. I highly recommend it. The one thing to keep in mind is that let me see if I can show you the decreases. She has really clever crown decreases. I mean, it's very satisfying when you have the top of a hat that looks as neat and put together as the rest of it. But because of the way the stitch pattern flows into the crown decreases, there's not really a whole lot of wiggle room in terms of, like, if you want to make it taller, you'd have to do another entire repeat. So that's just something to keep in mind. And she says all that in the pattern. Anyway, there's also a matching cowl that goes with this. That's a separate pattern that you would have to purchase, but it's really cool. It's got this pattern, and the way she does it is color blocking. So you have like a big chunk of, 2 or 3 colors or whatever, with several of the pattern repeat in it. So maybe someday I'll make the cowl to match. I don't know. But anyway, Cherry Rumble Hat by Thea Coleman using Periwinkle Sheep Merino DK yarn. Highly recommend both. I just realized I almost always forget to say what needle size I use when I do projects. The brim, I use size 5, and for the main part, I use size 6. And because this is superwash yarn, it did grow a little bit after I soaked it, which is good because when I first finished it and tried it on, it was really snug. I almost thought, oh no, this is too snug. I should have used a bigger needle. But once I gave it a good soak and just draped it over a drying rack to dry, now it's got just it relaxed a little bit. So I think it's a good fit for an average woman's head like mine. So that is my first finished object. My second finished object is a pair of socks. So they're just plain vanilla socks. I don't have sock blockers, so you'll just see them hanging out loose. I did not use a pattern. I did my normal formula, recipe, whatever you want to call it. So I always use size 1 needles for plain old sock weight yarn. I cast on 64 stitches and I did a 2x2 rib. And then I did some plain stockinette for a little bit. This is an Eye of Partridge heel. So that means that for this heel flap, when you slip the stitches, you stagger the slipped stitches so it kind of comes out in this cool, I don't know, plaid pattern kind of. I don't know how to explain it exactly. And then I always do this row of garter stitches on each side of the heel gusset, which makes picking up those stitches easier and neater. It's nice and tight. You don't have any holes here. And then I made my way down the foot. And for the toe, I've mentioned this before, but I really like doing the decreases along the sides of the toe. This is really going in and out of focus. I'm sorry. And then I get to about the last 16 stitches and then I knit 2 together all the way around and pull the yarn through. So you have this nice rounded toe, which I like better. Lately, I like that a lot better than the Kitchener stitch because I have not solved the problem of getting those little corners that kind of stick up at the edge of Kitchener stitch toes. So this is my method now. The yarn I used, I actually have it. It is called Wisco Sock by Utopia. I've talked about Utopia before. I should probably do a whole Utopia appreciation segment because I just love them so much. But anyway, they did not mill this yarn, but they do dye it. And it is in the color City Lights, which I love. It's kind of rainbow, but sort of a dark autumny rainbow. And because the color changes happen so quick, there's sort of a micro stripe thing happening here where every round was a different color except for the, for the heel flap where you're going back and forth a little bit. Anyway, I really love the colors on these socks. They are not for me, however. They are for a friend of mine whose birthday is this week. And the last time I was in grad school, we were in grad school together and we worked together for over a year, and I'm in a different job and she's in a different job, but we've kept in touch. And I'm having her over later this week for dinner with another friend of ours from the same program and workplace. And I just thought, well, if I'm having her over and her birthday's this week, then I have to give her a present. Part of that is because the other friend who's coming over is the one that I made these socks for, which are finally done, but I haven't seen them since I finished the socks. And I was thinking, oh good, if I don't want to say names just for personal privacy. But anyway, if person number one is coming over, then I can finally give her socks. But then I thought, well, but person number two, if her birthday is this week and I'm giving socks to the other person, that just doesn't seem right. And they're both just wonderful people who are totally people I love to knit for. So anyway, so they're coming over for dinner and they're both getting a pair of socks from me. So these socks, I talked about these before, so I don't want to reiterate the whole thing, but I made up the pattern for these, which is pretty simple. It's just top down, kind of a rib situation happening, but I did this faux cable down the cuff and down the top of the sock. And I would like to write this up as a pattern, but I haven't yet. I did take some notes. They're pretty cryptic. So even after I give them away, I don't think I'll have any problem recreating them, for my own use. But man, I think pattern writing must be, that'll be a fun new challenge for me. I wrote years ago when I had a knitting blog, I wrote a few patterns that I just put up there for free. There's a couple hats and accessories, nothing that involves extensive grading or sizing, because that's just not something I've tried. But socks, even socks, which you would think are pretty straightforward, there's a lot to think about. So, for example, I would like to write this pattern because it's pretty basic. I mean, it's basically a plain old sock that I just inserted a little bit of interesting stitch pattern in. There's nothing novel about the construction. But even so, I think it would be nice to have it available for different sizes, different foot circumferences and a few different gauges, because this is in fingering weight yarn, but I think it would work really nicely in a sport weight or a DK weight. It could be a nice thick house sock for wearing when it's really cold, or a thicker sock for hiking in cooler weather. Anyway, and there's a lot of math there, which is fine, but the part where I get stuck, so for socks, how in the weeds do I want to get here? One of the things about knitting socks that I find very, very satisfying is that the proportions work out so beautifully. For example, generally speaking, for the average fit, okay, your cuff circumference is going to be the same as your foot circumference. Now, I know this is not true for everybody, but it's true for the socks I make for myself and for my family. So generally speaking, you're gonna have the same circumference for the cuff and the foot. And generally speaking, if you're doing a heel flap, which I do, your heel stitches are going to be half the stitches as the cuff. And generally speaking, unless you need to make a very long instep or something, the number of rows you do down the heel flap is going to be the same. I have to think about this. So like if it's a 64 stitch sock and you do 32 stitches on the gusset, then you're going to do 32 rows. Yes, 32 rows down the heel flap. So anyway, you can see how it all the proportions really are just very satisfying. The one issue I have with writing this up as a pattern with a lot of different numbers, because I think I could do a formula and kind of plug those things in, is for the heel flap here at the bottom. I just figure it out as I go, but if I were writing instructions, I would have a harder time making the instructions for this part clear. So if you're not a sock knitter, and if you're curious, basically what you do is you knit this heel flap, which is basically square, and then when you get to the end of it, it's so blurry. When you get to the end of that heel flap, you have to you don't knit all the way across, you sort of go back and forth to make kind of a wedge, and that's where the heel of your foot will fit in. So the proportions there are a little different. It's not always quite so straightforward, and I just do it by feel at this point, or by rote basically. So writing out the instructions would be a little more complicated. And then the toe's not that big of a deal, because you just decrease on the sides every other round until you get to a certain point where you're either gonna Kitchener it up or do the other thing like I did before with pulling the thread through. Anyway, all that to say, I haven't started writing out this sock pattern, but I would like to. And part of the thing that has me stuck, as I mentioned in a previous episode, is that because I'm not a designer, I don't get paid to do this. I'm not interested in getting paid to do this. I've been in the gig economy before, and it can be really hard to make that work. I haven't totally figured out how I'd make sure that it is accurate and something that I really want to put out there. So most designers will have their patterns tech edited. So you send it off to somebody who makes sure that all the math is right. They will often help you with formatting so that you have a nice looking document. And then you pay them. And it can cost, I don't know how much it costs because I've never had anybody tech edit, but it's going to cost a certain amount of money to pay somebody for their time to tech edit. And then on top of that, you need test knitters. So people who are knitting your pattern, make sure that the wording makes sense. They're often kind of a double check on the math. And then they also have samples that they can show and make sure they look like what you envisioned, things looking like when you write the pattern. So all that, I think it's totally worth the expense and the trouble if you're a designer, if you are making money off of it somehow, either as a side hustle or, this is much more rare, like as your actual job. So, and this is not my job. So I'm stuck on how to proceed with that. I think what I could do is just do everything myself, put it out there for free, see how it goes, but I'm still kind of thinking through that. So there has been some discussion online that came up recently. This is something that cycles through every few years. You'll see discussion about test knitting. And it's been a little controversial, I guess. Because there are so many new designers and there's an explosion of knitting on social media, like Instagram particularly. So there's been a lot of questions around what are the expectations of test knitters. And what should they expect in return? How should they be compensated? And if so, how? So I'm not sure, because I'm not a designer and because my test knitting experience is limited to one person that I've done this for, I think I will just share a little bit about my experience and what the expectations have been, rather than pass judgment on how other people do this. So I will say that I have test knitted patterns for only one person. That is Thea Coleman, also known as Baby Cocktails. I've shared that before. I did a whole episode a little while ago with a sweater I finished last fall. That was Epernay. I'll make sure I link that in the show notes. But I've been test knitting for Thea for years. I mean, more than 10 years. And I tried to count up one time and it was over 30. Mostly sweaters, but also some hats, plenty of hats actually, and other accessories. But my experience has been, she'll put out a call, and she has a really big pool by now, so this is why I don't do it as often, because she just has a whole lot of people who are willing to test for her. But the expectation on me is that I can use the yarn that I want, but often if she's usually by now collaborating with yarn companies or yarn dyers, so they will often offer a discount if you want to purchase the yarn that the pattern calls for, but it's not required. I mean, that's a whole expense. There was one time I did buy the yarn that she used in a sweater pattern, and it was wonderful and beautiful, but I can't do that every time, or don't particularly want to do that every time. But she's clear from that from the outset, that you can use what yarn you want. And she'll often offer suggestions for substitutes, or if not, list suggestions for substitutes, say like, look for these qualities, like light and lofty, or something smooth and drapey, or what have you, to show the pattern. Anyway, so the test knitter supplies their own yarn, they have their own equipment or whatever, and the expectation is that you will follow the pattern. You will let her know if you make modifications. Like the last one I did, the original design was more cropped than I would wear, so I added some length and I made a note of that, and also made a note of the yardage that I used so that she could take that into consideration when she published the final pattern. And then it's up to the test knitters to, if they find mistakes in their sizes, or if there is something unclear about the way the instructions are written, or if there is a mistake in the chart, or a mistake in the written instructions for the chart, any of that, anything you catch, you let the designer know so that they can fix it before the pattern is released, okay? The other thing is that when you're done, you ought to take some pictures and share them. I like to share on Instagram. I will put them on Ravelry, etc. I don't make a big, huge stinking deal about it. I will do like one post explaining this is what I made, yada, yada. But it's just so that, the advantage to test knitters sharing their project photos is that other people who may be interested in the pattern can look through and see what the design looks like on a variety of different body shapes and body types. They can see what it looks like in different colors. If you've got a range of yarn choices, you can see that too. There's just a lot of advantage to having test knitters do that for you. And then what I get out of it, I don't have to pay for the pattern because it was in a draft version, and I make and keep a garment for myself. This is not something I send to anybody else. I don't get paid otherwise though. And I think that's the source of the controversy, is this question of, should test knitters get paid? I don't know. I nobody's forcing you to test knit, and nobody can make a career out of that. So if you're going out of your way to volunteer to do it and you know what you're getting into, then don't expect to get paid. If you don't want to knit for somebody else without getting paid, don't volunteer to test knit. I guess that's kind of where I land on it. Anyway, all that aside, if I write up a sock pattern, I'm not sure that I want to manage the test knitting, and I don't want to, deal with all that. So, okay. Let's talk about the works in progress I have. There's just a few. The first is this bright pink sock that in my head, I'm calling it Barbie Splatter. Because, I mean, look at it. It really is a whole lot of different pinks, mostly pinks, on sock yarn. This is still the first sock. It's almost to the toe. I tried them on and put a little marker at the point where it is when I tried the sock on, and I thought I needed about another inch before I would decrease for the toe, so I'm not quite there yet. But this is easy, mindless knitting, something that I can pick up when I'm in a meeting or at a webinar or something. Now that I'm done with the birthday socks. So, I don't have much to say about it. It's a 60 stitch sock. I did 2x2 ribbing for the cuff. I changed to garter rib for the main part of the cuff, and keeping that as I go down the top of the sock. And the yarn is Plymouth Happy Feet Splash in the color Lipstick that I've just had sitting in my stash, waiting for a day when I wanted obnoxious bright socks that didn't take much thought to knit. So that's what I have going there. I mentioned last time that I wanted to make a sweater for my younger niece whose birthday is coming up. And I've gotten as far as knitting the swatch for it. Can you see? Boy, this just does not want to focus. Here we go. So in the light here, it looks pretty gray, but this is sort of a purplish gray, grayish purple. The color is called Thistle. The yarn is Cloudborn Pima Cotton DK. I bought this on clearance from Webb's. And I have 2 skeins of it. So it may end up being a short sleeve cardigan, depending on how the yardage holds out. Each of these is 225 yards. So I've got about 450 yards to work with of DK weight. And I'm planning to make the Juliet cardigan, which is a really sweet little top down. It's got like a lace heart pattern that goes in panels down the fronts. And that's what I'm going to make for her. So my gauge is off by 1 stitch over 4 inches. The pattern calls for 22 stitches over 4 inches, and when I measured it, I was getting 23. So this is cotton yarn, and it would probably stretch. I'm aiming for the size 4. So I could, if I wanted, just do 1 extra increase, because it's a raglan. I could just do 1 extra increase before dividing for the body and sleeves. I could leave it as it is and expect it to stretch. I'm not really sure. When it comes to kid size sweaters, especially when you're in that preschool through young elementary age, I think the main difference is in length more than circumference, because kids tend to kind of just stretch out and get taller generally. They're not getting just a whole lot bigger around at that point. So as long as I make it long enough for her and it's not like too tight, I think the sizing will work out okay. The other work in progress I have, this is the big one. This is the reason I had all this time to do these extra projects over the weekend. This is the Jones cardigan. Still not going to say who it's for, but I have sleeves now. It is a tin can knits pattern. And I'm making a fairly large size because it's for a grown adult man who is significantly taller than I am. So the pattern, it's pretty simple construction. You cast on all the stitches for the main body, knit up to the armholes, split, do the fronts and the back separately. I did a 3-needle bind off for the shoulders, and then you pick up the sleeves and knit them down. So the sleeves is what I spent the last couple weeks doing. And then I'll have to pick up approximately 1 million stitches for the shawl collar, because you go, all for the whole fronts and around the neck, and you do a shawl collar, so they're short rows with buttons and stuff, buttonholes, I mean, and that will be the sweater. So I wanted to soak it thoroughly and give it a good blocking before doing the collar, and it took a few days to dry, which is why I had the time to do the socks and the hat and stuff in between. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do that was so that the length would be final, so I wouldn't get anything wonky when I picked up stitches, and also because I'm eating crow just a little bit, because I had talked for a while on my last episode about how I was using heavier weight yarn than the pattern called for. And I did this whole thing about how I did the math to figure out how many to cast on and how to follow the numbers for one size and the measurements for another, yada, yada, yada. Well, I still don't know how this happened, because I worked out the math at least 3 different times. And I measured the swatch and everything, but it's actually coming out smaller, not by a whole lot. Well, several inches actually. It's coming out smaller than I originally intended. Still not exactly sure how that happened. Like I said, the pattern calls for DK weight yarn. I'm using worsted. I think I forgot to share this last time, but I've got Wool of the Andes worsted weight. This is the color Cobblestone Heather, so it's a nice medium dark gray, heathery gray. And so, like, just in plain stockinette stitch, the gauge is about 5 stitches to the inch, and the pattern calls for DK, which would be tighter than that. So I did all this, and before I soaked it and blocked it, I measured it, and it was like a whole lot smaller circumference than I was expecting, even accounting for, some inches that will get added for that shawl collar and button band. So I thought, well, most of this is moss stitch. It's moss stitch panels. So moss stitch is where you knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. On the return row, you knit the knits and purl the purls, but then coming back again on the right side, then you purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. So you've got 2 knits and 2 purls and stacked up on each other, and then you alternate for the next 2 rows. And that tends to stretch a little bit with blocking. So I stretched it out when I laid it out to dry, hoping it would get a little wider, and it did a little bit. Still not as much as I was expecting. But I also tried it on myself, and it was enormous. So I don't know if it's hard to gauge, when you're a completely different size than the person you're knitting for. So we'll see how this goes. That's the short version. But all I have left to do is the collar. I will probably finish this and send it off before I do another whole episode. So maybe what I'll do is when it's done, just film a little segment that I can pop into the next episode so that you can see it in all its glory. So this is the Jones cardigan by Tin Can Knits. And it's a very easy knit. This is so repetitive, it's easy to memorize. Moss stitch is a little slow going, but it was great, TV knitting, early morning knitting. So that's one of the reasons it went so fast. I've only been working on it for less than 3 weeks, So that is my work in progress. That is all the knitting I have to share with you, but I have been doing some reading, and it's been a long time since I have shared anything about what I'm reading. So if you don't care about books and literature, sayonara. I hope you enjoyed what you saw so far. But I'll just take a few minutes, to share what I've been reading. So the first is that I read this book by Isabel Allende, who is an author I love. It's called A Long Petal of the Sea. The title, I believe, is taken from a Pablo Neruda poem. And Pablo Neruda is actually one of the characters in the book. So I think it's not very interesting when people go into long explanations about the synopsis of a book, but basically it follows several people in a family who, it starts in 1936 during the war in Spain against Franco. And it follows several people as they hurriedly have to leave the country as refugees and eventually end up in Chile on a boat that was called the Winnipeg, that was sponsored by Pablo Neruda, who wanted to bring, artists and intellectuals into the country out of Spain. And then it follows their stories over many, many decades and ends, I think, in the early 90s. So this is pretty typical of Isabel Allende's writing, where she covers like long spans of time, and there's a lot of political history in there, but it was really, really good. And one of the main characters is a concert pianist, and that just really piqued my interest. So highly recommend. In fact, it was so good that I decided to check out the book she just came out with. I've not even started reading it, but it's called Violetta. And I believe it was inspired by her mother. So her mother, who lived to be nearly 100. One of the things I love about Isabel Allende's writing is that she often writes over these long spans of time. You learn a lot about history just through her novels. And she tends to write about really strong, ambitious women. They're not even always like good people. There's one book called Inez that's about a female conquistadora from like the 1500s that's pretty brutal, but it's just always like really interesting women who have a lot of drive and ambition, and I appreciate that. I find that inspiring. So anyway, I'm looking forward to reading that. And then the other book that I'm currently reading, and I'm trying to get through it fast because it's already overdue at the library, and I'm such a library delinquent that I'm feeling guilty, but it's called The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan. I think it just came out this year, and I'm pretty sure I heard this recommended somewhere and put a hold on it right then and had to wait a little while. But without giving too much away, it's about a woman who has a toddler. She's a single mother, and her toddler is taken away by Child Protective Services. And it's just about like what she goes through to be a good mother. I mean, it's kind of dystopian and futuristic in ways, but not even that far off from reality when you really think about the narratives we tell each other in society about what it means to be a good mother and how we judge mothers and what we think of as being a good mother. It just sort of takes it to that extreme. And it's riveting. I can't put it down. So you can see where my bookmark is. So I have this much to go. I'm like 2/3 of the way through, and it's just really good. And it really makes you think. So that is what I'm reading. That is what I am knitting. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.